You're listening to Boobies and Newbies, brought to you by the Frolic Podcast Network. Happy holidays, everybody, and welcome to a special holiday edition of Boobies and Newbies, the podcast that asks novice romance readers to think outside the dick in a box and brave the unbridled world of erotica. I'm your host, Kelly Reynolds, and today's romance review marks the 10th episode in this year's Boobies and Newbies annual holiday special, the 12 Days of Boobsmas. With only 2 more podcast episodes of the season, we are just days away from Christmas, and I, for one, am very excited, both to celebrate with my friends and family, but also to just take a break. But don't worry, because Boobies and Newbies will return in late January 2022, and the best way to know what we're reading, reviewing, and who we're interviewing is to join us on Patreon, where you will always be the first to know what is up next for the podcast. But I am getting ahead of myself. It's not January yet. It's still December. And we are rounding out our month of holiday-centric romance reads with A Marriage in Trouble. Because what says Christmas better than a... anyway. You can always go back and check out the previous 9 days of Boobsmas episodes, all of which you can find on our website, boobiesandnewbies.com, or on your favorite podcast app. Joining me today for the 10th day of Boobsmas merriment is professor, writer, and bruja, Dr. Maria DeBlassie. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I am a longtime fan and listener, so this is very exciting.
Oh my gosh, it's so funny because I'm a longtime fan and follower of yours. I'm a big fan of your content. I follow you on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm a recent subscriber to the newsletter. So
thank you.
I love that we're connecting this way. It's always funny when people are like, I'm a fan of yours. I'm like, no. I'm a fan of yours. You're doing me the favor by being here.
Turns out we've been quietly mutually fangirling for some time.
We can do that quietly behind the safety of our computers these days.
Gotta love it. It's like introvert love over here.
Yes, exactly. So I'm a big fan. Like I said, I really enjoy reading some of your articles and blog posts. And most recently, I enjoyed an infographic you put together on courtship novels.
Oh, yes.
And I was wondering if you could share like a little bit about the topic, because it so clearly relates to historical romances today, and seeing as we're talking about a historical romance today, it feels only appropriate.
Yes, so I put it together because I'm teaching a class for the first time this semester on bodice rippers and courtship novels and the modern historical romance novel, including those that are more inclusive. And I started out in romance really loving courtship novels, and that's what I ended up doing my dissertation work on. And so as I was putting this together for my students, I was like, we just need like a really clean, objective way of looking at what courtship novels are and how they have inspired the modern historical romance. So I looked at the social context, women in the 18th century starting to write these stories. It actually started with a man, but, starting to center women's lives more domestic lives, and really just emotions and feelings, and particularly how women negotiate the marriage market. And I say women, but it's like basically middle and upper class women, right? But so I looked at that, and then I looked at like courtship conventions of the era, like how are these things feeding into the way we read this, and how then this inspired the modern historical romance and what's changed. So, it's getting more inclusive, which I think is just delightful. And so it was really looking at these two things coming together more closely, because as I've fallen deeply in love with romance novels in general, I realized not a lot of people are talking about their origins within the courtship novel. So I was wanting to make that a little more clear, and also celebrate like the echoes that we see that in the modern romance today, but also like what's changed and what's changed for the better.
And what still needs to change.
Exactly. And what still needs to change. Because some stuff that was really progressive in the 18th century is maybe less progressive now. So maybe we want to like shift some narratives around a little bit.
Well, and as we know, anybody who's a longtime reader of romance knows that the genre has evolved, will continue to evolve, and it is not without its growing pains. And
exactly.
That's perfectly okay. I mean, I think you could say the same thing about any type of, genre, whether it's books, movies, TV, any kind of media.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think part of the joy is recognizing that those growing pains are there and thinking about how we can be more conscious consumers in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of ties into the discussion that you recently had with my good girl Andrea, host of Shelf Love podcast, which if people are not listening to, please do yourselves a favor and listen to it, because Andrea does a fantastic job of not only discussing some of the romances we love or wish we loved more or used to love, but she also takes more of an academic approach to it, which I really appreciate listening to. I love education in general. I love higher ed. And so anytime I can listen to people, analyze things in a way that I am not able to articulate myself, I absolutely adore it. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, except I cannot eloquently put it in such a way. So I'm a big fan, but I recently listened to the episode where the two of you talked about I always mess this word up. Joyful problematization. There we go.
It's a mouthful.
So, it only took 2 tries.
Yeah. Well, first, like you said, I just, to pile on the fandom, the girl fandom, right? The girl love, Andrea is just wonderful. And I love the conversations she brings up to make us just think about these things. So we got together thinking about that concept of joyful problematization. And she too put an infographic together for my class, and it's on my blog, The Bruja Professor. And we really just started thinking about getting away from these tense binaries of, I love this thing so much, it can do no wrong, or I hate it so much, it's all bad, and saying, let's start looking at these things, particularly romance and the books we're reading or the movies or the shows, and think of them as historical or cultural artifacts. Yeah. What are they telling us? What is beautiful and joyful about them? And what's also a problem? So we're looking at things more holistically, and we're also not judging people. We're not judging ourselves for the moments where we maybe didn't know enough about something, or where, we're seeing our learning curve happen in real time, right? So we're saying, reframing it instead of like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed I didn't know this, to, wow, look at how much I've grown, or look at how much my community has grown. So just having a lot more fun with this growth process and these conversations, which can sometimes feel loaded if you're not approaching it from a perspective of curiosity and collaboration and just enjoyment.
I agree. And I think the whole concept of, let's see if I can do it again, joyfully problematizing. That was it, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Joyfully problematizing. I think what we read, watch, consume in media, I think it's something that a lot of people can connect with today, even if it's on a subconscious level. It's something that I think a lot of people might be doing without realizing. And I think it's a great alternative to canceling, which is a word we hear thrown around a lot today. And it's in relation to cancel culture, as people might, have heard. So I think it's a great opportunity to really kind of think about why something is making you feel the way you're feeling, as opposed to just leaving it at, this book makes me angry. Well, why does it make you angry? Let's unpack that. Like, let's talk about where those feelings come from. And is it the book? Is it you? Is it something that the book brings out in you, a memory, a bias that you weren't aware of? And so I definitely do not do as wonderful a job as Andrea does in terms of having these conversations on the show. However, I think that this is something that, as a reader, just in the 4 seasons of doing this podcast, that I feel like I've grown as a reader in terms of the fact that I now kind of question myself of like, that's an unlikable heroine. Well, why is she unlikable to me? Why is it a problem that she's unlikable?
Right.
Is she unlikable? Am I jealous? What's the deal? Like, so I find myself questioning myself a lot more as opposed to like the books that I'm reading.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked how you addressed the issue of cancel culture. And, I wrote about this in an essay of a similar topic that Andrea and I covered. And I tackled the issue of call out culture, which is like people just want to go full roast on the internet to like prove their righteousness of their ideas on someone. And it's like, is this a productive conversation? Like, where is your desire to roast someone coming from? Like, is it doing the meaningful work, or are you seeing that as an outlet to maybe express something that maybe you need to work through more fully? And I think the really important thing is saying, well, let's have a conversation without having to like skewer anyone, with the assumption, that most people we're talking to do genuinely want to grow and explore.
Yeah, assuming they want to have the conversation with you too. And if they don't, I don't know if they're ready to have a conversation. And that's okay. I mean, that's something that then hopefully they can explore within themselves. But at the same time, you cannot force somebody to be ready to have specific conversations with you, no matter how much you want to have them.
One thing we talked about is my experiences like in higher education with people being really like, professors being really aggressive about, you have to have this conversation, and really intense. And it's like, it pushes you out of the conversation and makes you actively resist it, because it's like, this is very loaded energy. I don't know what I'm walking into.
Right.
Like, why are we antagonistic right off the bat?
Yeah.
And so instead it's like, hey, let's explore this thing. And we all love this genre. Unpacking its joys and its problems is an act of love. And, one thing I love about your podcast, I was just catching up on the episode about the witch with her 2 werewolf lovers.
Witches, wolves, loved it.
There we go. And I loved, like, you bring such a sense of joy to everything that you're reading and talking about. And it struck me as you were talking about polyamorous romances, just how wonderful the conversation was. It was like, this is just a normal part of my reading. And if you're not familiar with polyamorous romances, here's something to keep in mind. And I was like, that's such a nice thing. It's like, it's a subtle thing, but I don't think people realize how nice it is to be like, polyamorous romance. Now I want to know more. This is cool.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it reminds me of the first time I was in grad school and I was doing a performance of the Vagina Monologues, naturally. Which no shocker, I'm sure, to anybody listening, but also I've done this show like 5 times. But it was the first time I had ever sat in a circle with a group of people to like introduce ourselves. And it was the first time anybody had ever asked me to introduce what my pronouns were. And I was like, I'm confused. Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know. What am I supposed to, like, she, her, I'm a woman. Like, and it was the first time I had ever seen that happen in a room. And I mean, granted, this was only, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. Like, this wasn't really that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And it just made me recognize, like, first of all, the sense of privilege that I've had, but also looking around the room at this incredibly diverse group of people that I'm with, that this was something that they had to incorporate into their everyday lives, of like every time they meet somebody new to introduce themselves with their pronouns, to every time you go on a date with somebody, come out as, bisexual, pansexual, whatever it might be. And it just really blew my mind. But ever since then, I've had this conversation with people before of just like, the more that we can normalize things that, I don't want to use the term like have been not the normal or, not the traditional way of things. But the more we can normalize these conversations, the more they will become ingrained in just the way we speak and the way we interact with each other, where it won't be something that we have to do on a daily basis to, share every little tidbit about ourselves. We can just be, I don't know, human beings with each other.
Totally. Yeah. And it's, it's interesting with pronouns because I actually learned that from my students too about 5 or so years ago. And you start like, wow, this is beautiful. It's not hurting anybody. In fact, it's actually making things better for a lot of people. And let's center and normalize historically marginalized identities. Let's bring let's bring these conversations out into the open so it doesn't feel like we're hiding in the shadows or something, or that it somehow is meant to be deviant, because and so that's what I really loved about your episode, where it was like, this is just like a normal conversation. It wasn't like, this is our specifically polyamorous episode and we will never talk about it again.
No. And also I will read as many polyamorous relationship romances as I can. I love them. And let me tell you, it just seems like a better and better option every day of my single life. I'm like, you know what? This does seem like this could work out really well for all parties involved, assuming that everybody's on board. So I am not opposed to the options, let me tell you.
Right. All my favorite television love triangles right now, I have just like fanficked them into, polyamorous relationships. I'm like, this is what you need to be.
Literally my answer to every love triangle romance. I'm like, just get together. I don't understand what the issue is.
It's clear. Yeah, I'm like, it's clear all three of you have very good sexual chemistry together, which is why I followed you for, 10 seasons or whatever. Let's just make this happen.
It's so true. It's such a throwback, but I remember there was an episode of True Blood where one of the men, I forget if it was Eric or Bill or Sam, one of them had like a dream where they fantasized about one of the other men, and everybody in the fandom like lost their shit. They were like, why isn't this happening? Why isn't this a reality? And I was too young to think that at the time, but now in hindsight, I'm like, oh yeah, that was definitely a thought on my mind for sure.
Yeah, that needed to happen.
Yeah. Just a future fanfic to write is what I'm hearing. So.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about, obviously, you've written about courtship stories, you've written about novels that have inspired romance today. So I'm curious, what's your relationship with the romance genre in general? Are you a longtime reader? Has it always been historicals?
Ooh, that's such a great question, because when I started like really seriously studying it, like for my job as an educator, I would have said I really deep dove into it about like 5 or so years ago. But as I studied the genre more, I realized like I've been reading romance all the time, like this whole time.
They tricked you.
Yeah, I was like, so like I really got into courtship novels. My mom always watched like the BBC Jane Austen and those sorts of things. So it like makes sense that that was where I ended up going. I did creative writing in undergrad, but then I took this phenomenal class on Jane Austen novels, and I was like, I want to know more about all of this stuff. So that's why I reread it a little bit. And I just loved these novels that centered, at the time, centered primarily women and emotional lives. Like, that is my catnip. Like, paragraphs of people thinking through their feelings and, staring at someone else's, like, neckline or whatever. And so I really fell in love with that. But, then I realized, like, once I learned more about the genre proper, the way it's talked about is, in terms of pop culture, is like bodice rippers or kind of contemporary romance, like chick lit at the time, Bridget Jones's Diary. But I realized I was like, I've been reading it the whole time. Like, I got into urban fantasy pretty hardcore in graduate school. And I was like, a lot of that though, like at least half of it was paranormal romance. Like, I understand that now. And I was reading like steampunk romance and fantasy romance. Ooh. And, all this stuff. And I realized like, basically, like I understood the feminist value of having a story center a woman that wasn't about romance. But I was like, I don't care about that. I want the mushy gushy sexy stuff and the feels. So I realized like I'd been reading that for a long time. And then in my research for this class, looking at bodice rippers more, I realized one of my favorite authors when I was younger, her name is Celeste DeBlassie, and her name sounds a lot like mine, so I felt like very...
I was about to say,
Yeah.
I was like, are you related?
Yeah.
Like...
Oh, yeah. Well, and she wrote about, like, Spanish California Southwest, which,
Ooh.
like, when you look back on it, it's kind of like the mixed race mestiza, like...
Sure.
Like, my background, but it's, like, more coded because you had to be at that time. But I was like, I felt very sophisticated reading her books, especially The Proud Breed. And I thought of it as like historical fiction at the time, but I'm like, I look back and I'm like, that's a straight up bodice ripper. Yeah. Like I was reading her stuff for like the sexy times, and it made me feel very sophisticated and adult. And, you know, I was in like my tweens when I picked her up, and our names were so similar, and I knew I wanted to be a writer at that time. So I felt like super sophisticated that I was going to write these like epic sexy books. And
yes,
so,
just like Celeste.
Exactly, just like Celeste. I even wrote her like fan mail, which got returned because I'm sure she was like had passed away by that time. You know,
no,
it was like, you know, our little lined paper. Was so funny.
The dedication. Oh.
Yeah. I thought I was so sophisticated, but so I look back and I realize like romance novels have been with me like from the start. I just didn't I didn't realize that they were there, because if you're not really immersed in the genre, like the way they're framed, you aren't necessarily realizing that what you're reading is a romance.
Yeah, and also I think there's a lot of talk about what romance is from people who are not within the romance industry, let alone people who have maybe never read a romance novel. And
Exactly.
So I think if you're not already woven into the scene or interested in reading romance, then you can very easily be turned off by the things that you hear about romance and the way that romance is presented in pop culture.
Oh, totally. I was talking to another person I really love, the person behind The Art of the Clinch on Twitter, and we were saying, you know, when people think of romance novels, they think of Fabio and they think of those clinch covers. And I will say, like, even before I really started reading bodice rippers seriously, knowing what they were, like, I always collected those covers because I thought they were outrageous and delightful. But again, I was like, it was from an outsider's perspective. Like, here's this thing that I love, but it took me a while before I really started reading them seriously.
Yeah.
Or the old, would get like the Harlequins and the kind of category romances. You know,
that's how I got started for sure. Was category romance, because you know why? They were at Target for $1.69.
Totally, and I was always finding them in like antique stores or used bookstores, and it's like $1. Okay.
I mean, it's and that's the other thing, is it depends when you come into romance reading. Like, sort of, if people are starting their romance reading journey in 2021, I think a lot of the titles you're seeing are illustrated covers that are a lot less, shall we say, intimidating than having a bare-chested Fabio on the cover. So, I mean, it's definitely different, and it was different for me coming in with more like category and contemporary romance than it was for maybe somebody my mom's age who most of what was offered to them was historical romance. So I think no matter where you start, there's always going to be something that maybe draws you in or maybe pushes you away too, depending on what it is that's there. But you also don't know until you dive in to see that there's so much more than just the books that are marketed to you at the checkout line at Walgreens. You know, there's a lot more than that.
Yeah, and it's also like, so there's a used bookstore in Albuquerque where I live, and it specializes in romance. Like, I mean, they have just a room full of category romances and a room full of like, you know, classic bodice rippers. Like, it's really, so I would go in there and I'd look around, but then I'd get really overwhelmed because I was like, I don't even know where to start. So then it was like, what do I know? Like, what's good, what's not, like, where do I even go? And, you know, thanks to the internet and places like, you know, Smart Bitches Trashy Books, that's where I was really like, okay, I can get a sense of what's out there. I can read reviews, and now it's so much easier to navigate.
For sure.
And I'm glad the genre is becoming a little more mainstream, and that it's exposing people to
Mm-hmm.
beautiful stories. But I gotta say, I miss the clinch cover. I do. My dream of dreams as a writer is to have like just this outrageously illustrated pirate clinch cover for one book, that one of these books that hopefully I'll write one of these days, but like just
Yes.
outrageously robust clinch cover featuring, brown skinned people of color that look like me, and just like sexy over the top. So the readers know, like, yeah, this is going to be swashbuckling, sexy, bodice ripper action adventure. And there is no two ways about it.
Well, first of all, I would read the shit out of that book. Secondly, I'd love to see contemporary clinch covers. Like,
Yes.
I'd love to see like, a teacher on the desk or something. I bring them back. Go wild with them. Like, why not?
Yeah, totally. Because there's this whole push with all genre, including like horror and fantasy, to like have these like cleaned up, vaguely floral or nondescript covers or illustrated covers, and I'm like, just like embrace the niche of the genre that they're writing to. Like, that is beautiful. It doesn't have to be sanitized.
No. There's so many more options. Like, the illustrated covers are charming. I get it. But the ones that I feel like we end up talking about a lot are the ones that really make a splash, that are different in some way from that. And especially now that the illustrated covers become so popular and so mainstream. But I have no doubt you'll get your swashbuckling pirate clinch cover someday.
Thank you.
Well, okay, so that's writing in the future. So before we dive into today's reading, I'd love to know a little bit about you as a writer and what you've got out today, because I know that you just published a book recently.
Yes, well, thank you. So I write both nonfiction and fiction. So my nonfiction focuses on everyday magic. So looking at ways we can make our daily life more enchanting and more magical. So I think of that stuff as like for the pagan or witchy curious. So people who want to have a more magical life but are maybe intimidated by the Instagram worthy posts of like thousands of crystals and all these spells and it just feels intimidating. So the book that came out there recently and for my nonfiction was Practically Pagan: An Alternative Guide to Magical Living. So it's like really simple steps where people can just focus their attention and awareness on ways to make their lives more magical, by crafting routines and turning them into rituals, by really tuning into what you're feeling when you're feeling it. So it doesn't require an extensive knowledge in the occult or a $10,000 crystal. It's just like, how do I start living more magically today, right now, where I'm at? And that's then nice. Another story that came out, which I'm very excited about, is under my own imprint. It's called Weep, Woman, Weep. And it is a New Mexican Gothic fairy tale, and it is based on the legend of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman. And it's really about how you heal from ancestral hauntings and generational trauma, but also through discovering what it means to feel joy and to cultivate joy. And bodice rippers actually play a heavy role in that. So it's also very much a love letter to the stories we read and the things we do that help us tap into our profound capacity for joy and pleasure.
I love that.
Thank you. Yeah, so it starts a little dark and heavy because it's Gothic, but my fiction, I like to think of it as I write cozy Gothic, so little
Gothic. Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with that.
Thank you. So it's like it does get Gothic, but I'm not going to end doom and gloom. It's like, we're going to figure out, all right, we got this problem. Let's work through it. And let's I always say you got to face the darkness in order to find the light. And that's really what that story's about.
That's wonderful. And hello, I mean, when this episode drops, we're a few days away from Christmas. You could one-click that and have that shipped to you ASAP to share with a loved one or your book club or whoever, just in time for the holidays. So
right.
I like it. Cozy Gothic. That is a term I'm going to be thinking about for a while in a very fond way.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's time we dive into today's reading, which is not a cozy gothic. However, it does take place in the Victorian era, so there is that. Today's reading selection is The Captain's Midwinter Bride by Liana De la Rosa. And this historical second chance marriage in trouble romance was published in November 2020. It's available on Amazon for just $1.99 Kindle edition. Such a deal. It's also a quick read. I know when I downloaded the book, it told me it was about 110 pages. So definitely something that you can read in, the span of an afternoon, depending on how quick of a reader you are. And this book was actually brought to my attention by the author herself, Liana De la Rosa. A few months ago, I spoke with Liana along with author Dylan Crush during a Facebook event that centered on the second chance romance trope. And we all shared, our thoughts about second chance romance. If people don't listen to this podcast, you probably don't know that it is not my favorite trope in general. But Liana suggested The Captain's Midwinter Bride with the added caveat that the second chance element was between an estranged husband and wife. And I was hooked based off of that knowledge alone, just because I feel like we don't see a lot of lived-in relationships in romance. They're definitely out there, but it's a lot more unique than, the typical enemies to lovers, friends to lovers. So I was hooked based off of that. And then the fact that it took place at Christmas, sold. I'll take it all. So
Totally.
this is a new to me author. This was my first read of Liana's books. But that being said, I will say I am 100% on board to read more of her work. So What about you, Maria? Had you read her before?
I hadn't, and I loved it. I am so looking forward to reading more of her books. Like the second I finished this, I actually went and looked her up online because I was like, I like this person.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, there's more Liana De la Rosa in store for us. So let me give everyone the brief Goodreads synopsis, brief-ish. And then we will dive into our discussion. So it's really funny because I will say it is not the most holiday-centric book. It does take place during the Christmas season. However, just by the synopsis alone, you might find yourself wondering, where's Christmas? It's there. It's toned down. Let's leave it at that. So
yeah, it takes place over the Christmas time period.
Yeah. And you know what? For some readers, that's all they want. They don't need the hullabaloo that comes with the holidays. And I fully respect that. I like mine with maybe a little bit more tinsel, a little bit more cookies, but to each their own. So
right.
Here's the synopsis for you. Life at sea sharpened Captain Phillip Dalton into a shrewd and strategic military man. Yet none of those skills prepared him for the intricacies of planning his daughter's upcoming Christmas wedding. See, there it is. His family, most especially his wife, are all but strangers to him thanks to his service to the crown. But if Philip finds himself bewitched by his practical, charming, and guileless wife, I love that word, guileless, he does his best to hide his struggles. Annalise Dalton raised 2 children and built a comfortable life for herself while her husband of convenience provided for them from afar. But now Philip's home to stay, and she finds it impossible to ignore his gruff manner, brilliant blue eyes, or the gentle way he looks after her needs. And if Annalise is unnerved by the budding feelings for her husband inspires in her, she does her best to hide how they unsettle her. When past secrets and misunderstandings threaten the tenuous steps they've taken to create a real and loving marriage, can Philip and Annalise overcome the years they spent apart to forge a happy future together and for every Christmas to come? There you go. They said Christmas twice. That makes it a Christmas book.
Officially, yes.
That's the if that's the scale we're going off of. There you go. They said Christmas. Yes. So, well, okay, overall impressions. What do we think?
I really enjoyed this. Like you said, there wasn't a whole lot of Christmas to it. And for my historicals, I like a lot of mistletoe and things being snowed in. Like, I don't need, that historicals are kind of what got me into Christmas stories to begin with, because I just liked,
Oh, okay.
yeah, like, so I liked that they were like less family drama than some of like the contemporaries, because my knowledge of some contemporaries was like, sometimes some toxic things could happen and then be like, but it's okay because Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So in historicals, it's basically just like getting snowed in and smooching under the mistletoe. And I'm like, I can do that. I like that. Like, and like dancing and drinking grog. And I'm like, I can do that.
Oh, yes, the grog.
The grog, exactly. And a little caroling. Cool, let's do it. But I actually, even though this wasn't like a like super Christmassy in that way, I actually really loved it, because it felt like the way it was set at the end of the season, or like in December, was like, it was almost like a vacation pause while the central characters are trying to figure out who are we going to be in the new year together. Like we
Oh,
have,
that's sweet. I love that.
yeah, it's like we have this little bubble where we're just trying to figure out
Mm-hmm.
how do we move forward. And I love that. That's one of my favorite things about stories set in December. So I also, this is like just me getting older. So one of those moments where like you reflect and you're like, oh, my tastes in romance are changing. I love that they were in their 40s and like
Same.
they had gone through some shit, and that so much of their romance was centered on like huge competence porn. Like,
Yes.
wow, this,
oh, my favorite.
yeah, I know, it was so hot. I was like, fan self. He's like, wow, she's so smart and she's, you know, she's so capable. Ooh, and then like she's thinking about him like, oh, he's so handsome, but also really grounded and thoughtful and a good judge of character. And I'm like, yes.
Yeah, daddy. No, that's I'm with you. I will say, I mean, like it's in my Instagram bio, competent men are my kink.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I really loved, first of all, it's such a small thing, but the fact that it takes place in Bristol and not London, I
Yeah.
also really enjoyed, because I feel like I do love the hustle and bustle of like a historical romance set in London. Like they're in the city, cobblestone streets, carriages everywhere, lights. I get it. I love it. But there was something nice about this one, like also being kind of removed from that. And it makes sense that he's been a naval officer this whole time, because I think Bristol is set on the coast of England. So, you know, that makes sense for them to be there. I liked that. And then, like you said, I love the fact that it starts with them 25 years into their marriage in their early 40s, because, you know, you get married when you're a child bride in England at this time. So, I mean, honestly, the fact that they've been married for 25 years and she's 42 years old and they have two like grown children, one of whom is getting married, I was like, whoa, that's a lot just in modern context for me to like wrap my head around.
Totally.
But for the time period makes sense. And it's a narrative that I don't think I've really, at least I haven't read. I'm not saying it hasn't been explored, but it's something that I haven't read, to see a marriage where they've been together this long, spent so much time apart. They're still very much strangers to each other and, you know, still want to connect, you know, both emotionally and sexually. And there's no shame there. They're both very interested in exploring each other's bodies. And I loved it. I will go on record and say it's maybe one of my favorite novellas I've ever read.
Yeah, I really loved it too. And it's, you know, I was reading it at a time like very intense activity during my teaching life, and I was like, wow, this is just like so soothing. And one of the things I loved about it is like they're both just really good people and you love them right away. And there's moments where, you know, the author could have completely leaned into like big misunderstanding tropes, or like, we're not communicating and this could be resolved in 2 seconds, but we're going to draw it out for 50 pages to make a novella. I love how the author sidesteps all of that. Mm-hmm. And there's moments where like the wife, Annalise, could really judge something, could really judge Philip for some stuff they discover about her, like the way his father mishandled her inheritance, and he thought she was well provided for early in their marriage. It turns out she wasn't, because his father and brother like completely manipulated her out of money.
Yep.
And she could have laid into him and been like, you terrible person. And instead she's like, yeah, we were both bamboozled. Yes, it hurts, but I'm not going to hate you for something you didn't know.
And also it's in the past. Like, I mean, that's the other thing. I liked that part too, because I kept thinking like, oh, maybe this is going to become like a bigger part of the plot, is like them figuring out what happened to the money and somebody gets justice. And I'm like, and she's very, sensible about it. She says like, look, this happened years ago. I don't need this money today. Like, we raised our children, mostly me raising the children, but they're raised. They're good young adults at this point. So we made it through. Everything's fine. Let's not focus on what could have been, because that's actually something in my personal life that really bothers me, is when people kind of focus on things months that happened, like months, years even ago, when you can't go back. Like, it's how can you make better choices today or different choices today while still being informed by the choices you've made in the past, as opposed to going back and changing it, because that's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that made me feel like this was a very mature couple,
Yeah.
Instead of saying, oh, I'm such a terrible victim, it's like, well, that's upsetting to learn.
Right.
We can't go back. And, Philip, he has this moment where you do see him, it's just a line or two, but basically he's trying to contact his brother so he can resolve this issue. And you get a sense that it'll get taken care of, but it's not their priority. It's like, yeah, this is upsetting, and I want my brother to know that we know what happened and stuff will get dealt with, but that's not the center of this. And instead of being resentful, Annalise, instead of being resentful of like all the time she went hungry, she's like, well, that changes everything. That, the way I look at the past, but I don't live there anymore. Let's move forward. And Philip too, he's like, okay, I could feel really resentful that my kids don't love me because I haven't been around. Instead, he's like, I'm a little hurt, but let's figure out how we can be a family together.
And they're a very forward-thinking couple, I think, especially for the time, because the main plot that's happening is them organizing their daughter Beth's wedding, which is supposed to take place at Christmas. And the entire time, both, Annalise and Philip are like, I don't know about this guy she's marrying. Like, and instead of it being a thing of you have to marry him, you have to be married by a certain age, like any of the pressing arguments that, I mean, as somebody who's researched courtship novels is definitely familiar with, let alone anybody who's read historical romance novels are familiar with, they're very supportive of Beth having her own choice and deciding whether or not this is the man she wants to be with. And, committing to somebody for the rest of your life is something that should be taken more seriously, as opposed to just, this is the first guy that asked, so you should say yes. And I loved how supportive they were, not only of each other, but also of their children.
Right. And like Beth, the daughter, when she's like, I should go through with this marriage, I can't back out now. And the mom is like, well, hold up here. What do you want? And I think that's such a nice reversal of tropes, because the tension isn't my parents are forcing me. It's I think I need to be doing this in order to save face. I do too think, like, when we're thinking about the expense of the wedding and all of this, there's this really beautiful moment where, Beth tries to roast her dad for not being around, and Annalise just checks her. She's like, he's the reason why you can have an expensive wedding. Like, he's the reason why you live comfortably and you have a dowry. Like, I love that so hard, because particularly in like holiday movies, there's always like the overworked father figure who needs to learn the Christmas spirit.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, but he's also like working really hard so that you so that you can have all these luxuries. And it's like, it's not as easy as saying like, you need to work less. It's like, he's providing for his family.
Yeah, it's true. There's always and this translates between books, but also like Hallmark Christmas movies, that there's always the person who, because they work, quote unquote, too much. They are the overworked character. They're also a Scrooge, you know? I mean, and I'm like, those two don't have to be like mutually inclusive of one another. Like you don't have to, because you work so much, also hate the holidays and hate spending time with your family and celebrating togetherness. Like you can also be a hard worker who just doesn't have time for everything. Like I totally get that. So yeah. I also loved that for Philip, you know, along with this being like a marriage that they're exploring and really just getting to know each other like much later in life at 42, it's also like a different side of a story for him in that it's really very much about somebody who's like retired. Like it's about a man who has spent his life serving the queen and had this incredible career at sea. And yes, he had to make sacrifices to like leave his family for long, extended amounts of time. But then what does that look like when you come home? And I think like the best way to apply it today is thinking about what it's like for soldiers, for people who are in some sort of the armed services, retiring and having to kind of reacclimate themselves to civilian life, which I think is probably really difficult in a multitude of ways. But just sort of, I think, acclimating yourself to like everyday life of like having, you know, the not it's sort of the same thing every day, but also not the same thing. Like at least if you're, you know, in the armed services, like you always put on your uniform. There's some sort of like regularity and structure to it that I don't think necessarily exists when you're at home and you don't have anything that you have to do. So I thought that was a nice way to look at it through that lens.
Totally. And like his whole identity is being a captain and being this authority. And now he's like, well, who am I outside of this? And
right.
There's like a really cute line, which I'm totally going to butcher at the beginning of the story, but it's basically like, I'm used to being the captain, but Annalise is the captain here. Like this is her domain.
I'm the captain now.
Yeah. And he's also respectful of it. It's like, he's like, this is her domestic sphere. I don't want to come in and just be like, here's how things are. Like, who am I? What's my place here? And they both have such like really cute moments where they're like, well, I want him more. Does he want me more? And he's like, well, does she want me more? But I want her more. And so it feels like really human, believable conflict.
Yeah.
That doesn't need a lot of, even, you know, Beth's marriage where she's realizing maybe she doesn't want to be with this person. That feels really relevant to me even today. Like where people start talking themselves into relationships that aren't super healthy because they're heartbroken because someone else threw them over, or they're feeling like I'm getting too old or whatever.
No, I have a couple highlights that I want to share, both of which I highlighted specifically because they also felt like very modern ideas as well. And I don't know what that says about us, that this is an idea that is from 1852 and it still is very relevant in 2021, not in a good way. Right. So both of them relate to sort of like the societal demands for being both a man and a woman. So this was the one that Annalise is sharing with Beth, specifically having to deal with like what it means to be a woman today. And she says, society is only concerned with a woman's looks and her reputation. And if she loses one or the other, or heaven forbid, both, the woman ceases to serve any purpose. It's cruel and unfair. Okay, Here's the other one about being a man. Because someone has taught you, and this is from Annalise to Philip. Because someone has taught you that to be a man means you need to be invincible, omniscient, and that's simply ridiculous. You are the bravest and kindest man I know. And I was like, well, there's toxic masculinity in a nutshell. Good to know. We can trace it back multiple hundreds of years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, so like traditional courtship novels, so much of it is like, you know, we talk about toxic masculinity today and like healthier ways of being a human being regardless of gender identity. I mean, all of that was in courtship novels. You know, it's like beware the Wickhams, if we're going with Pride and Prejudice examples. Beware the Wickhams, keep an eye out for the Darcys, like, here's how to read people. And a lot of it was literally like a lot of the men being written into these stories were explicitly written as models against toxic masculinity, although they didn't call it that at that time. It was
Right.
like rakes and rogues and libertines.
Rakes. Ooh, libertines. That's one I don't hear as often as rakes and rogues. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
we should bring it back. I really do think I
we
need
do
more
too.
libertine.
Yeah, me too. But yeah, I loved that. And that particularly Annalise's quote, you know, again, she could, you know, in a less well-written story, she could have roasted him for trying to be captain of her domain,
Yeah.
whatever. And instead she's like, wow, I'm sorry that you've been dealing with the weight of these expectations. That's really awful. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, and as much you know, wisdom as Annalise doles out and shares with both her daughter and her husband, there are also moments where she questions herself and just sort of like, you know, what my daughter is like afraid to speak her mind. Did I do this? Did I raise her to believe that she needs to exist in a world where she can't say what she feels or thinks? You know, and so I liked that as, you know, wise as she was and as outspoken as Annalise was, she still had these moments of subconscious, you know, internalized thoughts just about herself that were, you know, sometimes guilt. And I think that's something that a lot of mothers and parents in general can relate to as well.
Oh, totally. And the way she, like, when she finally has that conversation with Beth and she's like, let's
Mm-hmm.
just clear some things up just in case you're like modeling yourself on some perception of how you're seeing how
Yeah.
I deal with the world. And one thing that I really loved about this too, like if we're talking about gender roles and
Mm-hmm.
is when they finally have sex and he's looking at her like naked for the first time, right? And he's like, you've changed, he said, around her worried flesh. And she's like, two children change the body, you know? And she's like, you know, hello, I'm a grown-ass woman and I had two
Right.
kids. And at that moment, you're like, which way is this going to go? And he's like, no, you've changed for the better. And he's like, you're softer, rounder, so utterly beautiful. I've always thought you unspeakably lovely, but now you're a goddess. And I was like, oh my God, I love that. Because it's like
Yeah.
a mature man appreciating a mature woman. And again, I think that's something like today people are still like, or, you know,
Grappling
I'm
with.
saying like socially in terms of
Yeah.
pop culture, like people don't value, you know, changing bodies and
Right.
that beauty looks differently. And again, this is where I really feel my age as like an adult woman and a romance reader, where it's like things that might have not been sexy to me in my 20s are very sexy to me now.
Same.
Like, yeah, like the fact that he's like, yeah, you're softer and rounder. That's like, I love that you've grown into like your body more
Yeah.
versus like, why are you not a size 0 19-year-old?
You've literally, by the way, that's the passage that I highlighted for my sexcerpt for
Oh,
this
I'm
book.
sorry, I took your
Like,
sexcerpt from you.
no, it's okay because it ended with not only does he call her a goddess, but he says, "And like a goddess, you deserve to be worshipped." And then he goes
Yes.
down on her, and I was like, "Ooh, yes, sir."
Yes, I love that. Yeah, and this is what I talk to my students about. Actually, is like speaking of normalizing things, like normalizing specifically het cis men going down on het cis women. Like
Mm-hmm.
we do not see that enough in media, and when we do, it's always treated as like this taboo transgressive thing, when, you know, we see like blowjobs being performed all the time on media and it's
I
not treated
know.
in the same way. It's like the man's really empowered by this versus, you know, if he goes down on a woman, it's like transgressive. And
Yeah.
so
Ooh.
I love that.
He's
Yeah.
a feminist.
Exactly. Or, you know, that's how a lot of movies get the NC-17 rating.
I know. I remember watching a documentary years ago called This Film Is Not Yet Rated. Have you
Mm-hmm.
seen that one? And it's all about like the MPAA and how they do the rating system. And the director, I'm forgetting his name. I think it's Kirby something. And he basically like interviews different filmmakers, different actors, and, you know, finds that there's a very unequal playing field when it comes to discussing and portraying female sexuality or queer sexuality on screen than male sexuality on screen. And so it was very eye-opening. And this came out like probably in like 2000, 2001. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Like this movie got an R rating because she's masturbating over her underwear and you don't see anything, versus this movie got PG-13 because of this. I mean, it was so outrageous just to like watch that.
Yeah. It's really shocking how they judge it, and it shows a lot of our sexual biases for sure. You know, one thing I really loved about this, speaking of that, is that like Annalise is very open about wanting to continue a sexual relationship with Phillip. She's just sort of like, how do I broach this subject? And there was like a sexier scene, I think it was like right before this.
Yeah, let's get to the sexcerpts, because I already shared mine. Well, you shared mine for me, so thank you.
That's sorry. And it's like right before that where he's like, have a care. It's been too long since I've last had you. I'm not certain I can be gentle. And she's thinking it had been too long, over a year at least. You know, the heat simmered in her hot core. And she says, which I think is like a very sexy line, I suspect I've outgrown gentle. Yes. And I was like, woo!
Loved that line. And you know what, to be fair, this is the only really like sexy scene that we have in this book. So I mean, it's definitely not like super high on the Steam rating, but it's a high heat for me because of like the quality of the sex scene. Like it's such a different quality that I'm used to reading. And I think it is because these characters are so mature, not only in the way they think and act and talk, but just in their relationship in general. It's just a very mature relationship, which is, I think you don't necessarily get when it is a new couple. And because they've been together for so long, that's what makes it so refreshing to read.
Yeah. And they even talk about like how their sex life has changed.
Yeah.
Like from their like, I don't know, they call it like furtive, you know, quick couplings or something, you know, like very, you know, colorful language. But it's like when you're young and you don't know what you're doing, but you're hot for each other. And it's like now that they're both older and they know they're going to be together without, you know, long breaks, it's like, let's really take some time to explore
and appreciate it. Yeah, for sure. No, I'm a fan.
I think part of why the sex scene is so good is like the buildup is so good. Like there's some great scenes where they're at the party together, and when Philip first meets Beth's betrothed, he's like not impressed. He's like, this guy's a tool. And Annalise is like, I respect you for thinking that, because I too think he's a tool. And there's a moment where they're like at a party engaging with Beth's fiance and her soon-to-be mother-in-law. And Annalise is just like marveling at how competent Philip is in dealing with the situation and assessing this man and like putting him in his place, but also testing him. And then there's other moments where you see Philip doing that as well. And it's like, wow, she's negotiated so much. She's so good at this. I just want to stop and marvel at how amazing she is. So by the time they get to the end and they help their daughter essentially call off the marriage, it's like super rewarding, because you're like, that's a parent thing. That is like a genuine real life parent thing where you help your kid like assert themselves in the world, and they let Beth do the explaining. But they're there for her. As she should, yeah. And they're there for her. And then the end was just so sweet to me. Like where he's like, they mamma mia it is what they did.
Yes, like, exactly. We're going to have our way. Since all the plans are done, we might as well get married.
Yeah. It's like the young kids won't, but we should. And I was like, that's pretty sweet. And I think coming from Philip, it's like from the, you know, the fearsome sea captain. Yeah. He's like, let's get a little more romantic. Let's celebrate this life we can now afford together. Like, it's just a really, even though we don't see the full wedding or the Christmas celebrations, like it is just like a really juicy, sweet moment.
He's a teddy bear. He is a teddy bear. And you know what? I'm not sure if Liana's already written them. I'm not sure if she has plans to, but personally, I would love to see more books in this world for both Oliver and Beth, their two children, because we don't get to spend a lot of time with Oliver. And for Beth, we're kind of left hearing about how there was another man that she was in love with. That's one of Oliver's friends. And I was kind of wondering like, well, I need some details there, because all we know is he like disappeared to London and we don't know why he never came back. So I've got questions.
Yeah, I want to read that book.
I'd love to see Annalise and Philip just pop up here and there in any future books, because they are a couple goals at its finest.
Totally. Yeah, I'm very happy for them. I'm glad they renewed their vows and saved Christmas together.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And as we get into, we'll get into our ratings for the book too, because I will say I do forget that like Christmas is happening in this book. However, I think a lot of like the themes and the messages that we usually use around Christmas are very present in this book. So while it might not be like a very straightforward like physical representation of Christmas, I think there's a lot of the emotions and you know, the needs that we have around the holidays present in there. So I'm going to keep that in mind when I give my holiday rating, which will probably still be fairly low, but it's in my brain. I'm like telling myself to challenge myself. So I'll ask you though, let's give this book a few ratings, and we've added a rating for holiday during the 12 Days of Boobsmas. So we are now rating for heart, humor, heat, and holidays on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the very best that it could possibly be. So let's start with heart. What do you think?
Oh yeah, the solid a 10 for me. I mean, just lovable people. You want to spend time with them, and they're just trying to figure out their stuff, and it just made me feel so warm and fuzzy. Yeah,
it's a 10 for me too. And I will say, you know, as we're, you know, coming to the close of the Boobsmas season, that the books this season have been a very heart heavy. Like it's been a lot of heart in these stories, which I think is what you want for a holiday read. So it's a 10 for me for sure. And like I said, I'm excited to hopefully read more about these characters. Liana, I hope you're listening. We need more. So
yeah, we need you to get on that, Liana. If you haven't already.
Yeah, I know. They could already be out in the world and I'm just not aware. How about the humor? What do we think? Haha?
I mean, I don't know that it was like a funny haha book, but I would say maybe like a 5, because there were like cute moments as like outside readers where you're like laughing at their awkwardness or their eye exchanges and their communication, like those sorts of things. So I think it was like very cute, but it wasn't like laugh out loud funny.
Yeah, I'm with you. I would give it between a 4 and a 5 for humor. Although for my own personal like humor scale, like it definitely appeals to me. Like I appreciate a lot more of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like tee-hee kind of humor, as opposed to just she ran into him with her coffee. Oh no, it spilled everywhere. Like that's not as much of what I'm looking for with humor. So if it was just for me, it would be a little bit higher, but on the grand scale of things humorous, I have to keep it like on the lower side. So
yeah, and there was some real cute lines like when they're finally like, okay, let's help our daughter break up with this tool, and then maybe you and I can go take a long afternoon nap, wink wink. I feel like that would be bracing. I mean, there was just some moments that just make you chuckle. Like, it's cute.
Yeah, it was cute. It was very cute. Okay, how about the heat?
The heat. Okay, this one's a hard one for me because on my personal scale, I'd give it like a 10 because like that competency porn like really did it for me. And so by the time I got to the sex, I was like, mature adults getting it on.
So
good. I was like, fan so. But for people who are maybe wanting more explicitly sexual content, it's probably like a 5.
Yeah.
But I was like, all the buildup for me, and then once they finally do it, you're like, ooh yeah, people with normal bodies, so hot.
Yes, I'm with you. I am absolutely with you. I'm the same way. I usually think of it as like, oh, for me, this is really hot, just because, ooh, they're mature. Ooh, they're talking about, does this work for you? There's consent. Ooh, yeah, yes, spicy.
Yummy.
I love that. But, again, thinking about like the broad range of romance that's out there and what we've read for the podcast before, I would definitely probably keep it at like a 5 or a 6. We do only get the one scene. There's, some good flirting and banter before and after that scene, right. But you've got like one open door bedroom scene, and that's pretty much it.
Exactly.
So.
And there was no lube anywhere, so
you have to take that into account. Damn it. God, I mean, take off points now when there's not lube.
What's the point?
Oh, and then our holiday ranking, our final one. So what do we think about that?
Ooh, well, I liked what you said about like the spirit of Christmas and like the themes, because, if we're looking at kind of the setting trappings, we don't really get a sense of like them decorating for Christmas or even really preparing for it in any way. So it'd probably be low on the scale, like a 1 or a 2. But in terms of, like you said, like embodying those values, I'd probably put it like a 5 or a 6, because it's just so cozy. And I might even bump it up to 7, because I think it does what I love about a good December or holiday romance, which is that it takes that time, like a very specific time frame, 2 weeks, where you're kind of vacation-y and you can like unplug from your real life to figure some stuff out. So I think it did that really well, which is, I think, pretty iconic in a lot of holiday romances.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm going to give it a 5, because for me, all of the emotional aspects of the holidays are there. It's more of the physical representation of the holidays that's not there. So I was feeling the holidays, but I wasn't actually like seeing or reading the holidays. So for me, it's halfway there in terms of the holidayness of the book. So I'll give it a 5.
Yeah, I'm also like, I should just, in case it wasn't clear earlier, I'm trash for mistletoe. So anytime a story can incorporate that, like automatic 10 rating for anyone thinking of writing historical romances.
You will enjoy then a couple of our other historical holiday reads for Boobsmas this year.
Ooh, I'm looking forward to it.
Oh boy. Well, that just about does it for us. But thank you so much for joining me today, Maria.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. Like I said, I was so excited, and I just love the work you do, and this is so fun. So thank you.
Well, the feeling is mutual. So I am very thankful to have you here. Where can the good people find and follow you, and of course read your work?
Thank you. So you can find me at www.mariadeblassie.com, and that's where you'll find stuff on like The Bruja Professor, where I write about genres that I love and invite contributors to do the same. And, again, with the joyful problematizing. So we celebrate and also safely explore some of the problems in certain things. And then that's also where I write about like daily magical tips and recipes and things like that. So it's all kind of mushed together, the tarot as well. And from there, you can find all my social media stuff too, where I talk about this a little more loosely. Like on Twitter, I iron out a lot of my ideas before they become posts. So you can find me there. Yeah. So if you like witchy, nerdy genre stuff, come join the fun.
Yeah, witchy things and romance things are like 2 of my favorite things. So,
yes.
I mean, it's no wonder that I enjoy following you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really fun. Like, as I got into romance more, I was like, it's so cool that there's so many witchy people in the genre. Like, this is awesome. Like, how did I not know about this community sooner? I'm just glad I know about it now.
Yeah, you found it. That's all that matters.
Thank you, Internet.
Thanks for joining Maria and I today, everybody. We've got 2 more days of Boobsmas, which means 2 more podcast episodes coming your way, all in the matter of the next few days. So look out for those. And without further delay, I'll leave you with this. On the 10th day of Boobsmas, my lover gave to me 10 tubes of lube.
On the 10th day of Boobsmas my lover gave to me 10 tubes of lube, 9 naughty spankings, 8 rock hard abs, 7 minutes in heaven, 6 billionaires, 5 Venus rings, 4 dukes of fucking, 3 butt plugs, 2 nipple clamps, and a hot hook up underneath the tree.
Thanks so much for listening. Boobies and Newbies is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.